And when I think that God, his Son, not sparing, sent him to die, I scarce can take it all in, that on the cross, my burden gladly bearing, he bled and died to take away my sin. And here's the key, and this is today's message. Then sings my soul. The first four words of that verse, and when I think, and then the chorus, then my soul sings. Then sings my soul. I'm going to point, sorry about that. I point that out to say, because that's what we're talking about today. The heart of worship. What worship truly is. I made a comment last week, and we were in John 4, and we're still kind of using John 4 as our basis point here, but we're really going to be all over the scriptures, and I got to apologize because I didn't get my little cheat sheet made up today. Some of you may or may not know I had a little bit of a difficulty last night with my truck tires. So I didn't end up getting that little cheat sheet made up for all the scriptures that I'm going to go to. So there's quite a few of them today, a little bit more than normal. If you want to write them down as we go along, just so you can go back, or just let them listen to them, let them wash over you, this is going to be important. Mainly, the thing I think is going to be interesting is just listening to it, hearing the stories, because we're going to be a lot in the Old Testament. So you're going to hear a lot of the Old Testament stories, and I want you to be able to let them wash over you so you understand what the meaning is. You don't have to memorize them necessarily at this point, but if you want to write them down just so you can go back later and check them out, that might be something you might want to do. But I feel like the way I said it last week, it might open the door for, because I made a comment. I believe it was that we don't worship only in song, and so how do you love your wife or your spouse? You don't just sing to them. You say, you do it in all kinds of things. But I feel like that opened the door maybe for worship in any way we kind of feel like it. And not that I said that, and maybe you didn't take it that way, but there are some that is the key. That is how they see it. Worship in any fashion necessary, because I'm worshiping my Lord, aren't I? So I can do that however I wish. Well, today I want to illustrate to you and discuss what is acceptable and what is unacceptable worship. So what is worship? What does it mean? What does it look like? The Old Testament Hebrew word for worship, it was used 220 times in 172 verses. The Greek word used 60 times in the New Testament. In John alone, it's used 8 times total. In John 4, it's used 7 of those 8 times. Those 3 verses we read last week, John 22 to John 24, it's used 7 times. So out of the whole Gospel of John, 8 times, it's in there 7. I was going to do my fingers, but let's do it that way. So I think it's this is an important spot, and this is what we were saying, the woman at the well, a new believer looking, Lord, where do I go? What church do I go to? What preacher do I listen to? What Bible do I listen to? She's not saying all that, but those are questions common to a new believer. So our focus for the subject, of course, is worship. And our text is, like I said, we're starting here in verse 22. So I'm going to go ahead and read that for you real quick. Verse 22 to 24. You worship what you do not know. This is Jesus speaking. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But an hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For such people, the Father seeks to be his worshipers. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. Well, what does the word worship mean? The Greek word proskuneo means to kiss, like a dog licking his master's hand. It sounds a little weird, but this means to fawn over someone, to crouch down, to prostrate yourself on the ground. It's to revere, reverence, adore, to worship. The root word of that, kaneo, even means dog. So that's what it's going at. It's you are coming to your master like a dog. And this is not to make fun or insult humans anyway, but that's the meaning that's going on here. This is what we think of. And a dog is very loyal to a man. It's man's best friend, right? But it's important to know if what's unacceptable or unacceptable. We have to know and understand what worship is. In an effort to figure that out, I did a deep dive on Israel's history, because let's face it, they weren't always on the up and up with God. And so I went back and I kind of figured, okay, where did this idolatrous worship start for Israel? Mainly it started when they went to Egypt. Because Egypt, if you remember Moses, when the 10 plagues came along, those were a condemnation on each one of Egypt's gods. So there you see pagan worship in Egypt. And this is where Israel, I believe, learned this. I mean, of course, it kind of came from Abraham's background, but this is where Israel as a nation learned it, because they had since learned from God and gone his way. But when Jacob moved in there because of his son Joseph and the famine for 7 years, Israel stayed there for 400 years. And if you remember, as we just said, Moses had to rescue them out through God's hand. So from that time all the way till the time that God punished Israel for this pagan worship was 1290 years. This was the exile to Babylon, when Nebuchadnezzar came over and destroyed Israel and brought them out of Jerusalem to Babylon. 1290 years between Jacob in Egypt and Israel exile in Babylon. Now, why am I saying all this? Because I just want to see how much during that time did they actually worship false gods, which led to their exile. 1290 years, they spent 774 years that we know of in pagan worship, mixed into their worship of God. That's 60% of the time in a 1300-year time period, 60%. But this is not just an Israel problem. This is a mankind problem. Long before Israel, Cain killed his brother over the fact of worship. The central issue then was unacceptable and acceptable worship. Abel's offering, we know, was accepted by God. Know why? Because he did it God's way. God had a prescribed way. It doesn't say that, and we look, well, what doesn't specifically say that Abel brought it the right way, does it? Necessarily, it doesn't list out all the things that Abel did. But we know that God told Adam, and Adam told his sons. And these weren't little boys. These were men. These were grown men. This was the time for them to bring the offering. They knew the time. They went and each did it on their own, like they have done plenty of times before. Abel brought the offering like he was supposed to, in God's way. Cain had a better idea. Look what I did, God. This is from me, right? This is my offering to you. It's a little specialer because I did it my way. I'm bringing something to you, right? Oh, we might think, well, what's wrong with that? Well, there's a lot wrong with that. And we're going to go through all that today. But there is only one acceptable way, and that's God's way. His prescribed ways, and like I said, we'll get into that. But there's a multiplicity of ways that we can do an unacceptable worship. I think most unacceptable worship falls into 4 categories. We could call them the worship of false gods, the worship of the true God in a wrong form, the worship of the true God in a self-willed way, and the worship of the true God with a wrong attitude. Now we're going to focus on the last 3 of these today. That's the worship of the true God in the wrong form, a self-willed way, and a wrong attitude. I'm just going to quickly touch on the false gods or false idols. And I think the thing that most comes to everyone's mind with false gods, they think of, or idols, they think of statues, right? They think of the golden calf. That's actually not an example of a false god. And you might go, wow, that's kind of shocking. Well, we're going to come back to the golden calf in just a moment. But 1 Samuel 5 talks about the Philistines capturing the ark. I'm not going to make you turn there, but I'm just going to go run through it in my memory real fast. The ark was taken by the Philistines in 1 Samuel 5, if you do want to turn there. And they took it to Ashdod, where they worshipped the god Dagon. It's like dragon with no R in it, Dagon. So they brought the ark inside the temple of the Philistines. And the next morning, when they came out, the Philistines noticed Dagon's statue face down on the dirt. Well, they put the statue back up. Next day, they came in. This time it was on the ground, but it wasn't just face down on the ground. His head was cut off, and his hands were cut off. Clearly, God was showing them what's what. The third time, God smotes the Ashdod territories with tumors. And they're like, okay, you know what? Let's have a meeting about this thing here. Let's get this thing out. We don't need it here no more. We need to get it out of here. Go. So let's send it to Gath. You may remember Gath from where Goliath was from. That's where he was from. So they sent it there. The same thing happens in Gath that happened in Ashdod. They get tired of it. They send it to Ekron. Now, 7 months has gone by at this point, or roughly 7 months. And the guys in Ekron are like, whoa, we've heard all this stuff. They're freaking out. Why are you bringing it to us? You're trying to kill us? This ain't happening. Well, it came there. They didn't know what to do with it, so it sat there for a little while. Finally, their wise men got together with their priests and said, what are we going to do with this thing? Let's send it back to Israel. Get it the heck out of here. So they even sent a guilt offering to go with the ark. To go, look, we just got to make sure God leaves us alone. I'm going to read to you verses 6 and 8 in 1 Samuel there. If I can find it. I may not be able to. Let me see. Yeah. Wrong page. Listen to what the Philistines say. Notice they've heard about the stories of Pharaoh in Egypt. Verse 6, why then do you harden your hearts? This is the priest talking to their own people. As the Egyptians and Pharaoh hardened their hearts. We had severely dealt with them. When he had severely dealt with them, did they not allow the people to go, and they departed? Now therefore take and prepare, listen to this, a new cart. That's going to be important a little bit. And 2 milk cows, I don't know if I'm reading that right, and where there has never been a yoke, and hitch the cows to the heart, and take their calves home, away from them. Verse 8, the ark of the Lord, take the ark of the Lord and place it on the cart, and put the articles of gold which you return to him as a guilt offering in a box by the side, then send it away that it may go. They're sending this thing back. The thing about the cart is going to be important a little bit. But notice, God has a zero tolerance policy for false gods. Even the Philistines saw that. Doesn't mean they corrected themselves, they just got it out of there. Most of us don't worship false gods that way. Some Buddhists may, they have the statues, Hindus. For our study today, like I said, we're going to focus on worshiping of the true God. And like I said, there are 3 ways to do that. In wrong form, self-willed way, and in the right way with a wrong attitude. I said earlier that mankind has a bent towards worship, right? We are made to worship. It's in our nature. Atheists worship. They don't think that they worship, but they do. And do you know what they worship? Anyone want to take a guess? They worship themselves. And mankind. Actually, as a matter of fact, I just right off the top of my head, I saw Richard Dawkins, one of the biggest atheists, the most hostile atheist in modern history, besides Christopher Hitchens, who died a couple years ago. He made a comment about a video about ants, how they work together as a team, and they formed a little train. They did this little thing, and he just thought that was beautiful. And he said, "This is evolution in progress. Look at this! Isn't this great? Beautiful." Someone made a comment about Romans 1, they worship the creation. Anyway, just came to my mind. But atheists have this problem where they won't worship. And why won't they worship? Because they say, we can't see God. We don't know this God. But like I said, they do worship anyway, don't they? So they, in their own sense, prove that they do have this thing inside them that we're prone to want to worship. And we understand that to some degree because we long to see our Savior's face, as we mentioned last week. And some little girl painted a vision that she had of Jesus, and some little boy saw the picture and said that he went to heaven, and that's the Jesus he saw, and now everyone worships that picture. 2014 in England, a man dropped 2 slices of bread into his toaster, and when it came out, one side had a burn on the side of the toast, and he said that looked just like Jesus Christ. His friend thought it looked like Ozzy Osbourne. But in 1977, October, Mrs. Rubio was making her breakfast. In the middle of hers, her tortilla burned on one side, and you may have even heard of this story. But they put it in a little glass case outside their home, and people came to worship it. Thousands and thousands of people over the years have come to worship this tortilla because it has a picture of Christ on it, or so they say. The daughter of the mother was embarrassed by this thing for years and years and years. Finally, she succumbed, and now actually she's actually the current state representative in New Mexico. And I would imagine her fame and whatnot got her there from the tortilla. She says, whenever I'm tempted to lose hope, I find it again by thinking back to how my mother regained hers. We're talking about her hope. Her mother regained her hope, and this is what she says, through a miraculous skillet burn on a freshly homemade tortilla. We find this silly. But what does God think of this? And some might even argue that they worship God after all. Aren't they worshiping the true God? I mean, they're thinking of the true God when they pray to this thing. Doesn't seem that bad, right? What's wrong with having a picture? Something to look at when we pray. A cross to hold in our hands. Something to remind us. This time I do want you to turn to Exodus 32. We're in Exodus 32. Moses had been up on the mountain for quite a while at this point. The people are getting impatient. Verse 1. Now when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people assembled about Aaron and said to him, "Come, make us a god who will go before us, as this Moses, the man who brought us up from the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." And Aaron said, "Take off your gold rings, which are on the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me." That when all the people tore off the gold rings which were in their ears and brought them to Aaron, he took this from their hand and fashioned it with a graying tool and made it into a molten calf. And they said, "This is your God, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." And I want to stop right there for a second. Notice they're worshiping the calf. They're not worshiping the calf itself. What do they say? This is your God. This is a picture in their mind of the God, and they even go on to qualify of the God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. So they're giving God the right. They're giving him the due. His honor is due. So they are worshiping the one true God. This is very important to understand. I'm going to turn back to chapter 19 for just a moment. Trying to make sure I got my notes right here. I'm going to read you verses 10 and 11. The Lord also said to Moses, "Go to the people and consecrate them today, for tomorrow they will wash their garments, and let them be ready for the third day. For on the third day the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all people." Then I'm going to skip over to verse 17. And Moses brought the people out of the camps to meet God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. And then this in verse 18. Now Mount Sinai was all in smoke, because the Lord descended upon it in fire. And its smoke ascended like the smoke of the furnace, and the whole mountain quaked violently. When the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him with thunder. And the Lord came down to Mount Sinai. We'll stop there if you're following that. So, in verse 19, and then in chapter 20, or 19 and 20, the people saw God. They saw him not in his true form, because no one can see God and live, right? We know that from Scripture. But they saw him. They saw a representation of him. So why then did they need an image of a calf? Remember I said I went back to Jacob when he entered Egypt? So where did they learn this behavior? I think that's the answer right there. I submit to you that God's design for you is to not know what he looks like. It's blank for a purpose. He wants you to think of nothing. He doesn't want you to think of an image, a picture. He presented himself to them as smoke and fire. And he said to them in chapter 20, "You shall have no other gods before me." And verse 18 of chapter 20 right there. Speaking of the people who heard the thunder, this is remembering the thunder, the smoke. All the people perceived the thunder and the lightning flashes, the smoke and the sound and the trumpet of the mountain and smoking. And when people saw it, they trembled and stood at a distance. Now listen to what Moses says. And they said, first they say to Moses, "Speak to us yourself, and we will listen, but don't let God speak to us, or we will die." They're terrified of this. But listen to what Moses says. This is specific. "Do not be afraid, for God has come in order to test you, that in order the fear of him may remain in you, so that you may not sin." What did we say a second ago? You shall have no other gods before me, right? That's one of the commandments. So he brought this to them in order to test you, that you may fear him. So the thunder, the smoke was for a reason. It was to make them fear him. And they remember the commandments. But what do they do? Back to the golden calf. In 1 Kings 8:10, I really am all over the place. It says this: "It happened that when the priest came from the holy place, the cloud lifted. The cloud filled the house of the Lord, so that the priest could not minister because of the cloud. For the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord." God is pictured as fire. In Acts, Stephen talks about Moses, right where we were talking about, and God in the burning bush. James, the brother of Jesus, the half-brother of Jesus. James called God the Father of lights. He gets that from, I believe, Psalm 136:7. "To him who made the great lights, the Father of lights." In John 4, in our main text, the last time that Jesus says it, I think it's in verse 23, it says God is spirit. Listen to Job in Job 32 and 33. 32:8, he says this: "But it is spirit in a man, and the breath of the Almighty who gives understanding." Not only is God a spirit, and we don't have a picture of him, but now we're starting to see a picture of ourselves. It is a spirit in the man, and the breath of the Almighty who gives understanding. In 33:4, he says, "The Spirit of God has made me, the breath of the Almighty gives me life." And then this in 38:36, "Who has put wisdom in the innermost being, or given understanding to the mind?" This is our point, in our first point. Which was, I have to look back at my note. Sorry about that. It's worshiping God in the wrong form. What makes us? Our soul. That's our being. Job said our innermost man, our innermost being. This is a physical representation of who we are. We are heart and soul. That's the image of God. That doesn't mean we're little gods like we've been learning on our Wednesday night series. The prosperity preachers love to talk about the little gods that we are. Speak it into existence. This is the essence of man. This is what we worship. We worship God, who God is. Spirit. That's what Jesus said. We worship God in spirit and truth. Not just what he is, but who he is. And frankly, there's nothing in the universe that could represent him. That's why we say he is outside the universe. We also say he transcends space and time. That's why I think it's dangerous for us to try to figure him out with a physical representation. I'm going to read to you real quickly an interview that I heard and read this week from Dallas Jenkins, the creator of the TV show. You might have seen the series or heard about it. It's called The Chosen. Now, in of itself, I'm not disclaiming The Chosen. I don't want you to get the wrong idea. But he made this statement, and it's interesting, and yet I think it's dangerous. He said this: us old school Baptists, we don't normally hear God's voice. We leave that to the charismatics, and he laughs with the hosts. But I felt God laying it on my heart, and I felt God laying it on my heart that in several years, The Chosen was going to be what people thought of when they pictured the disciples, when they pictured Jesus as people. Because up to that point, I'm still quoting, because up to that point, there's been movies and many series and mini-series about Jesus, but you don't have anything in your mind specifically about Simon Peter and Mary Magdalene. And I felt like God was saying this was going to be the definitive portrayal of my people, and this is what my people are going to think of around the world when they think of my people, and I'm not going to let you screw it up. I think that's dangerous. And like we said, I think there's a reason why God doesn't want us to know what he looks like. Which leads us to our second point. Because it reveals us about something in us that's exposed, worshiping the true God falsely through self-will. In Matthew 15:3, Jesus asked them a question that penetrates right to the problem. It's to the root of the problem. Matthew 15:3, this is just a short little sentence. Why do you yourselves transgress the commandment of God for the sake of your tradition? This is to illustrate that worship is other than what is prescribed by God. In 2 Samuel, Uzzah, we learn about Uzzah's fate, about putting his hand on the ark, on the cart. Remember the Philistines? They put on a new cart. How did the ark get transported before that? They had 4 little rings on the side, and they put poles through it, and they had a group of people that's their job was to designated to carry the ark. Uzzah was one of these people. And I don't know if I go there. Well, like I said in 1 Samuel, that's where we heard it. That's where we heard it. So this system worked for them. And the Philistines wouldn't know. They just did what they do. That's what they do. They put it on a cart and shipped it off. And it might seem like, well, what's the big deal? I mean, it worked, right? But this has to do with reverence of God. This is where worship resides. It's in our hearts and our minds, as Job said. I'm going to go back to Numbers real quick, chapter 7, for just a moment. I want to show you this isn't insignificant. This little detail of the cart is not insignificant. So in chapter 7 of Numbers, verse 4, then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, accept these things from them, that they may be used in the service of the tent of meeting. He's talking about the temple worship. And you shall give them to the Levites, to each man according to his service. So Moses took the carts and the oxen and gave them to the Levites. 2 carts and 4 oxen he gave to the sons of Gershon, according to their service. And 4 carts and 8 oxen he gave to the sons of, I'm not going to read that word, Merari, whatever, according to their service, under the direction of Ithamar, the son of Aaron the priest. Sorry, I just thought of an old comment where they said, how would you like to be the guy making out the name tags for these events? But notice verse 9. This is specific. But he did not give any to the sons of Kohath, because theirs was the service of the holy objects which they carried on their shoulder. This is Uzzah's line. This is his job. This is what he was born and raised to do in his temple service. So he knew this ark should not be on the cart. So when the cart is bumping along, because David says, hey, bring that cart up here. We're going to do this thing. And he's dancing before the Lord. Everyone loves that one. We're dancing, having a good time. They're bringing the ark. Everyone's singing. They got tambourines going. They got harps going. And the cart looks like it's going to bump and the ark is going to fall off. Uzzah puts his hands up and he dies right on the spot. Imagine someone just walking up here to worship and they die right on the spot. That'll put a dampener on your service.
Yeah.
He struck him down, God did, in verse 7, because God struck him down there for his irreverence. That's the word. And that word, no matter which language you go, the Hebrew, the Greek, Indian, Italian, worship means reverence for God. I was going to give you this here in Leviticus 9. I'm going to do that real quick. I think it's interesting. This is for self-willed worship. I'm going to skip along through verse 9. We're going to end in chapter 12. I'm sorry. We're going to skip along in chapter 9 real quick. You don't have to turn if you don't want to. Now it came about on the 8th day, Moses called Aaron and his sons. This is about Aaron's sons. This is what we're going to get to in chapter 10. Take for yourself a calf, a bull for the sin offering, and a ram for the burnt offering. Then to the sons of Israel you shall speak, saying, take a male. And he goes through this thing. Verse 5. So they took what Moses had commanded to the front of the tent of meeting. Skip down to verse 9. Aaron's sons presented the blood to him. Verse 11. The flesh and the skin, however, he burned with the fire outside the camp. There he slaughtered the burnt offering, and Aaron's sons handed the blood to him, and he sprinkled it around the altar, and then they handed him the burnt offering in the pieces. Skip down to verse 18. And Aaron's sons handed the blood to him. Verse 20. They now placed the portions of the fat of the breasts, and he offered them up in smoke. Notice at the end of chapter 20 or verse 21, just as Moses had commanded. Verse 23, Moses and Aaron went into the tent of meeting. When they came out, they blessed the people, and the glory of the Lord appeared to all the people. I went through all that to show you Aaron's sons knew the deal. This wasn't day one on the job. They knew the deal. They were there the whole process. They've been there. They've been doing it. Look what they do in chapter 10, verse 1. Now here's their names. This is the first time they're named. Now Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, there's 4 of them by the way, took their respective fire pans, and after putting fire in them, placed incense on it and offered strange fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded them. Skip over to verse 8, if you're following. Then the Lord spoke to Aaron, saying, oh, I'm sorry, I jumped way ahead there. Let's go back to verse 2. Verse 2. So I'll read part of the verse 1 again. And they offered strange fire before the Lord, which the Lord had not commanded them to do. Verse 2. And fire came out from the presence of the Lord and consumed them, and they died before the Lord. Then Moses said to Aaron, it is what the Lord spoke, saying, by those who come near me, I will be treated as holy, and before all the people I will be honored. This is reverence. We wonder why that might happen, and we wonder why they would do that. Maybe there's a hint right here in verse 8 and 9. Then the Lord spoke to Aaron, saying this. He's talking to Aaron. He just killed his sons. Do not drink wine or strong drink, neither. This is right after it happened. This is not like a week later, a couple days later, an hour later. This is immediately. Do not drink wine or strong drink, neither you or your sons with you, when you come into the tent of meeting, so that you will not die. Perhaps this had something to do with it. This doesn't relieve them of their responsibility, but doesn't help. In fact, we are told to renew our minds as an act of worship. Paul says in Romans 12:2, and I'll go there real quick. I said we're jumping all over the place, and I'm kind of sorry that we're doing it, but I really want you guys to get the idea here. Therefore, I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may prove the will of God, that is, which is good and acceptable and perfect. This is how we are to worship. We start it with our mind. It starts in the mind. Remember, we connected Job, saying our inner being with our minds. This is the heart and soul. What the mind knows, it respects. Reverence begins with knowledge. That leads to a heart that is true in worship. Modern evangelicalism is becoming more and more man-centered in its worship, even in its preaching and its teaching. This leads us to point 3. I mean, we just went through point number 2, where we're self-willed. The worship of the true God with the wrong attitude, and we're not too far down the road here. This is the man-centered preaching and teaching comes from this idea to win what they call the unchurched. It's a nice way of saying non-believers, the language is softened because they were trying to get people in that don't normally come to church. They have seeker-sensitive churches or seeker-friendly churches. This is rooted in the same kind of pragmatism that cost Uzzah his life. Do it because it's easy. Hey, look, it works, right? We put the cart on the thing on the cart and it worked. It worked for 7 months for the Philistines. They didn't die. They touched it all over the place. Stephen Furtick, and this is hard to believe, but he actually says in his sermon, you can watch it on the video, if you come to Elevation Church and you want to learn more, you want to dig deeper into the gospel of the Bible, you're in the wrong church. You need to go somewhere else. Could you imagine anyone saying that as a pastor of a church? Go somewhere else to learn the Bible. Why? Because they're just trying to win converts. That's the name of the game. We win people, you get on our team, and you're supposed to go out there and win people for the Lord. If those words ever left my mouth, you should fire me. I'm telling you right now. On the spot. Don't even let me finish the sermon. Let Tim come up here and say, yeah, guys, it's done. Jeff's been good, but time to go. Because you no longer have a church. If you're abiding in that manner, I want you to think about that. The fact that the elders haven't rebuked him reveals their hearts. But I don't want you to take my word for it. I want you to listen to the heart of God in Hosea 6:6. And I'm going to run through a few of these pretty quick. Remember, Elevation's main ministry, right? Bringing in new converts through their music. Now, quick word about Elevation. That's their big draw. They have Elevation music. That's their big ministry. They bring the people in. Churches like Bethel Church, they have Bethel music, Hillsong. Listen to what God says. Hosea 6:6. Therefore I have hewn them in pieces by the prophets. I'm sorry, I'm not in the right verse. Verse 6, for I delight in loyalty rather than sacrifice, and in the knowledge of God rather than the burnt offerings. If that didn't convince you, I'm going to go to Amos 5:21. I hate and reject your festivals, nor do I delight in your solemn assemblies, even though you offer up to me burnt offerings and your grain. I will not accept them, and I will not even look at the peace offerings of your fatlings. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not even listen to the sound of your harps. But let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever flowing stream. And then this in Amos 6, next chapter, verse 5 and 6. Who's improvised to the sound of the harp, and like David, who composed the songs for themselves, who drink wine from the sacrificial bowls while they anoint themselves with the finest of oils, yet they have not grieved over the ruin of Joseph. Now we begin to see why God hates these things. What does that mean, the ruin of Joseph? I'm going to turn to Ezekiel 9. You're going to probably be thankful when this is over. The Lord said this, "Go through the midst of the city, even through the midst of Jerusalem." Now this is a vision that Ezekiel is having of God. Okay? And God's telling him, go through the midst of the city, even to the midst of Jerusalem, and put a mark on the foreheads of the men who sigh and groan over the abominations which are being committed in its midst. He goes on to talk about them being slaughtered. Anyone who doesn't have the mark on their head from... Okay, so basically what's happening is Ezekiel's seeing the vision. Anyone who looks like they're sighing over the abominations happening in Israel, God wants them to be marked. Why do they need to be marked? Because the ones who aren't marked are going to be killed. A lot of people. Of course, I'm not going to read the whole thing. Ezekiel kind of has a little freak out about that, and Lord, don't do that. But this is where that comes from. This is to say that those who are broken over the abominations being done in the temple and in the church. Wrong worship. God is not honored as he requires, as he deserves. This is what Amos is saying. This is what all of them are saying. They do all this ritual and these offerings, these songs, these anointed ceremonies. We talked about prostrating on the ground. I went to a church one time and they were going to have a prayer meeting. In the prayer meeting, the guy lays down on the floor, face down on the floor, hands, arms out, and starts praying with his face on the carpet. I don't know what that was about. I guess this was to show how pious he was, how broken he was. Goes without saying, later on, it was found out there was a lot of sexual immorality in that church. Thankfully, we left. Their hearts are not right. Now, there are those who would say that what we're doing is stoic. Our worship is stiff and wooden. Maybe not even this church, but maybe churches like Lutheran churches and Presbyterians. They're cold. Their liturgy is just rigid. It's like a ritual. Some of the times they go for a weekly confession, renewals of all sorts, to avoid racking up some sins. Some notion of falling from grace, so you need to keep getting the grace, the means of grace, keep given to you all the time. This misunderstands the purpose of our gathering. I want you to understand that. That's where this is going. There were some that would have us believe that they offer a spirit-filled service, and we mentioned that before, meaning they can feel the Spirit move as an emotional response. And they accuse others of restricting the Spirit to move. Lots of heartfelt. There's nothing wrong necessarily with heartfelt. But Paul speaks of them in Romans 10:2. They have zeal for God, but not in according with knowledge. And some of them even teach that by obtaining the gift of speaking in tongues, you got to empty your mind and just start speaking syllables until it comes to you. Empty your mind. Is that what the song said, what we talked about? What did he say? I don't want to walk over there to have the thing humming at me again, but it was in your mind. And then my soul sings, right? Not empty your mind and just start speaking until it comes to you. Of course, this is, they say, how we learn the gift that's given to you freely. But you can learn to do it. Is it a gift or is it you have to buy it? I mean, I don't understand. This kind of, quote, style of worship leads to the music that whips up the emotion. And you have to. To produce that kind of worship, you have to whip up the emotion. Worship of the true God doesn't need to be kick-started with music. True worship exists in the place where the heart is engaged with God. But it's in accordance with truth about what's revealed. It's not what comes down to us mystically. This is like baptism, right? Is that a weird connection? Not really, because it boils over from what's already on the inside. This is the change that's already occurred in you. It just boils over. Worship is what boils over. Then my soul sings, right? In the same way, we don't need to worship. We don't need music to whip us up into a frenzy. It's because we've already had the change on the inside. We who have this change don't need to say, I didn't get anything out of today's service. Or I didn't feel the Spirit move. Or did you? I've heard this from a pastor's wife. The Spirit was so restricted in worship today. This was after the service, and people poured out their hearts and singing in their congregation. And I could see some of them crying tears, and the comment comes later, Spirit didn't move. Do you even hear yourself if you say that? Worship is not for you. Think about it. You didn't feel it because it wasn't for you. Do you get that? If you thought today's worship service was for you, you missed the entire point. It's for God. Amen. It's for an audience of one. Your learning is for the sole purpose, listen, the sole purpose of our learning is to elevate our minds to true worship. All forms of worship come from the heart. Unacceptable. It's from a heart that concocts opposition to God's order of worship. Acceptable worship comes from a heart that's obedient and in unison with God's heart. Remember, like David, he was a man after God's heart, even though he had so much sin in his life. But listen to what he says in Psalm 51. Against you alone have I sinned. What was he talking about? Bathsheba, Uriah. He had an adulterous affair with Bathsheba. That was against her, right? And it caused her to sin. And then he killed her husband. I'm sure Uriah didn't like that. But David says rightly, against you alone have I sinned in Psalm 51. We're almost done. And I mean it this time. Go to Isaiah. I'm going to go to Isaiah 1:4, and then we're going to come back to John 4. I want to nail down this idea about worship and where our minds are. Chapter 1, Isaiah, verse 11. What are your multiplied services to me? I have had enough of burnt offerings of rams. Verse 12. When you come to me, you come to appear before me. Who requires of you this trampling of my courts? Bring your worthless offerings no longer. Incense is an abomination to me. Verse 14. I hate your new moon festivals and your appointed feasts. Verse 15. So when you spread out your hands in prayer, I will hide my eyes from you. Yes, even though you multiply prayers, I will not listen. This is God. You ever hear a preacher say that? God's not going to listen to you? Wash yourselves, make yourselves clean. Verse 16, remove the evil of your deeds from my sight. Now this is why, right here. Verse 18, come now, let us reason together. All that was talking about their false worship, and he says, this is where you should be worshiping, right here and here. I'll go back to John 4. Because this is what he's seeking. He's seeking the true worshiper. The Father seeks such as these. What do you think he means by that? But an hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For such people the Father seeks to be his worshipers. What do you think he means by that? Let me ask it another way. What's the point of salvation? He seeks those who will worship him in spirit and truth. And who does that? Those that have received salvation. Some are growing. Some God is still rescuing from other false systems. Some are true worshipers inside these false systems. And they will come out as they grow. God promises to finish in us the work that he began. For those still coming, still seeking, keep coming, keep seeking. I'm going to read Matthew 11. I lied. I guess I got one more. I forgot about it. But this is, I think this sums up the heart of it. I didn't mark it in my book, so this is a freebie that even I threw me off. Verse 28. Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Let us pray. Father,